Launch. In January of 1975, almost 2 years before the 1976 election, I was working across the street as a senior fellow at Brookings. And along with 3 or 4 of my other senior fellow colleagues, we agreed to give a briefing for a relatively unknown Southern governor who came around wanting to learn a bit more about economic policy and foreign policy and the like. And when we sat down to brief him, he launched the session by saying, "Now, I know you folks don't really know who I am, so let me just tell you in about 10 minutes how I'm going to become the next president of the United States." And Jimmy Carter told us in precise detail how he was going to get the nomination, win the election, and become president. And over the next 22 months, events unfolded precisely as he said. Accompanying Jimmy Carter to that session was one person, Stu Eizenstat, who was at his side throughout the nomination battle, throughout the campaign, and throughout his presidency. And what Stu has produced here, and it's getting rave reviews from people like Michael Beschloss and historians as well as contemporary political pundits, is the definitive history of the Carter presidency, which in many respects is both underappreciated and covered many definitive moments in American history. For those of us who care about economics, they had to address double-digit inflation, the second energy shock, the closest thing to a hard landing the dollar in the US economy we've ever experienced, and Stu's got it all in the book in wonderful detail. So it's a great honor and privilege to host him here. Stu Eizenstat is a national and international treasure. He's been a close friend as well as colleague now for over 40 years, and I think the world of him. He's well known not only for his role as President Carter's chief domestic policy advisor, but for his many roles in the Clinton administration, as ambassador to the European Union, undersecretary at Commerce, undersecretary at State, deputy secretary of the Treasury to Larry Summers when Larry became secretary. What is not maybe known by as many people as should be is how Stu has played the absolutely definitive role over the years in assuring, as best one can, reconstitution to the Jewish nation, particularly in this country, for the cost of the Holocaust. He negotiated with a whole range of European countries reconstitution payments to make good as best one can what happened in that disastrous period in history. Stu's written a book about it. He negotiated it personally with incredible perseverance and skill to right some of history's greatest wrongs. And I think if he did nothing else in his life, we owe him an enormous amount for that. Most importantly, Stu was a high school All-American basketball player in pre-integration Atlanta, I must note. Nevertheless, it counts for something, particularly in this building. And so we welcome Stu to the Institute once again. He's been a great friend and supporter, and we're delighted to have him here with us today. Stu.
Thank you very much, Fred. I feel so much at home here because I've spoken before here and I've gone to many seminars, and I have a great respect for the Peterson Institute and in particular for Fred. I'm going to repeat something that I said when I spoke at his retirement party, and it evokes his interest in sports. And that is, they said that Yankee Stadium was the place that Ruth built, and the Peterson Institute is the place that Fred built. And I know that Adam has been a worthy successor as well. I feel surrounded by friends and colleagues, Steve Weissman, Ted Truman, Jeff Schott, Bill Lane, and many others who have been an important part of my life. And I needn't tell you about Fred's own capabilities and what he's done for this institution, but more broadly for the country in both the Republican and Democratic administrations. I'm going to do something a little different than I normally do in my book talks. I'm going to give a much more circumscribed summary of the book than I normally do, so that I can spend a little more time, given this venue, to talk about the economy during the Carter administration. So let me start by saying that Jimmy Carter's political hero was Harry Truman, and he placed his famous slogan, "The buck stops here," on his Oval Office desk. Both presidents left the White House highly unpopular. Truman is now remembered much more for his achievements than his failures, and I hope that my book will have a similar impact on reassessing Jimmy Carter as president, not just as an admired former president. I believe, and I say this even with the late George H.W. Bush, he was the most consequential one-term president we've had. Almost 70% of all our major legislation was passed by Congress, just under the percent of my first boss in the White House, Lyndon Johnson. He honored the office. He respected the institutions of government, the independence of courts and the judiciary, the role of the press, even when it was brutal to him. Vice President Mondale said it very clearly. We respected the law, we spoke the truth, and we kept the peace. Now, the rap on the Carter presidency is summarized by 4 I's, and one of the reasons that the book has gotten very good reviews in the New York Times and the Post and conservative publications as well, like National Review, is I'm very candid about the mistakes we made. Iran, inflation, inexperience by the president and his Georgia mafia, and inter-party warfare with the liberal wing of the party. I don't obscure these problems. I don't whitewash them. They're very real. But they did obscure the major accomplishments and achievements. And so I wanted to set the record straight by writing a full assessment. Mistakes, yes. Failures, yes. My own, yes, as his advisor. It's not a book that could be entitled "If He'd Only Listened to Me," but also the major achievements that I think have stood the test of time. The authenticity of the book is based on a unique characteristic that I've had since college and Harvard Law School, and that I brought into the White House, which is being an inveterate note-taker. This is based on 5,000 pages of contemporaneous verbatim notes. Everything I saw, everything I talked about, every meeting I was in, augmented by over 350 interviews, several with Fred, by the way, but I wasn't selective in terms of who I interviewed. I interviewed Republicans and Democrats, detractors and supporters, to try to give a complete assessment of the 39th president. To understand the presidency, you have to understand the era of the 1970s. It was a decade of epic change in which the post-Cold War, the post-World War II consensus had begun to break down as a result of our first loss abroad in Vietnam, urban violence. I remember being on a portico of the Johnson White House and watching 14th Street burn, and, as I'll discuss in more detail, stagflation. It was a decade in which a whole range of new social movements began that are very much with us today: the environmental movement, the consumer movement, the Black Power movement, now Black Lives Matter. The women's rights movement began in the 70s, now #MeToo. And yes, after Roe v. Wade, the pro-life movement. It was also a decade in which a new political force began, which is very much with us today, and which Ronald Reagan very usefully put together for a winning coalition, and that is the catalyzation of the evangelical movement into a political movement, particularly in the South. And Falwell, who started it, Jerry Falwell, called Carter not a real Baptist and accused him of harboring homosexuals on his staff. And Reagan married that evangelical movement as a new political force into Richard Nixon's silent majority of disaffected white blue-collar workers, and that is precisely the base of our current president. So it's been endured. It was also a decade of major change abroad. The Soviet Union was at the apex of its power and influence, huge increases in defense spending, threatening our own hegemony, going into Afghanistan, supporting Cuban proxy troops in the Horn of Africa. It was a decade in which a new political force, which I discuss in great detail in the book China, just began to inch itself onto the global agenda. It was a decade in which a Polish-born priest became Pope John Paul II and gave hope to those living behind the Iron Curtain, as did Carter's human rights policy. And yes, it was a decade in which a force that is with us to this very day engulfed our administration, the radical Islamic revolution in Iran. Let me very quickly, and again, in much more summary form than I would normally give, talk about Carter's accomplishments at home and abroad. The first is that the energy security we enjoy today, the lack of dependence on OPEC oil, which had reached more than 50% during our presidency, is heavily based on the foundation of 3 energy bills that we created during that period, which deregulated the price of natural gas and crude oil to allow domestic production, put conservation at the centerpiece with the first fuel economy standards, inaugurated the new era of clean energy with solar and wind, and Carter even symbolically, as I show in a picture in the book, put a solar panel on the White House. Carter was also a great, and by the way, the biggest problem we had in the energy bill was breaking the Gordian knot on natural gas pricing, which goes back to Truman, and he did it in a way you wouldn't see today. 2 Republican conservative senators, 2 liberal House members, Corman and Rangel, in the map room of the White House. The kind of bipartisanship is so lacking today, which was the formula we reached for natural gas deregulation, and now we will be the biggest energy producer in the world, in part because we unleashed those forces. Carter was also a great consumer champion. He appointed people from Nader's organization and other consumer advocates to regulate industries, not as today, taking people from or who lobby for those agencies to do so, and then passed truly transformative deregulation legislation that has totally changed the whole face of our transportation industry, trucks, rail, buses, and most important for us, airlines. He really brought airline travel to the middle class, allowed the Southwests and the JetBlues to operate, the UPS and FedEx air cargoes, without which it wouldn't happen. We also began the deregulation of telecommunications and inaugurated the cable era, and even ended prohibition era regulations that prevented the flow of local craft beers from competing. Carter was without question the greatest environmental president that we've had. Since Theodore Roosevelt, we doubled the size of the national park system with the Alaska Lands Bill over the fierce opposition of the Alaska delegation, which wanted the whole state available for oil and gas exploration. In typical detail fashion, Carter got a giant map of the state, put it on the Oval Office rug, got down on his hands and knees with Senator Ted Stevens, a conservative Republican, to show him exactly every parameter of the national park, what would be available for development, what wouldn't. And Stevens marveled to us that Carter knew more about the state than he did, having represented it for 25 years. In an ethically challenged Washington, all the major ethics legislation, 78 Ethics Act, the Special Counsel, which is morphed into Robert Mueller, Inspectors General, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, merit selection of judges, and much more, all were done in the Carter administration. We ran against Ford on the basis of Watergate. I'll never lie to you, a government as good as its people. And it wasn't just rhetoric. All of these major ethics pieces are still in place. He created the modern vice presidency out of a constitutional afterthought with Walter Mondale. It was a position of derision John Nance Carter said FDR's first vice president wasn't worth a bucket of warm spit. Actually, I'm cleaning the language up a little bit for the audience. And when Mondale and Carter were elected in '76, Mondale gave him a memo with 10 requests: access to all classified documents, the ability to go into any meeting with the president, one-on-one meetings in the Oval Office for lunch every week. Carter did every one of them. And then additional one that Mondale didn't even have the temerity to ask for, he moved the entire office of the vice presidency from the executive office building across the alleyway from the West Wing into the West Wing to demonstrate that this was to be a real partnership. Here's a Southern governor from the deepest part of the Deep South, and I just went back to Plains a couple of weeks ago, no traffic lights, it's just the same as it was, and he appoints more women and more minorities to judgeships and to federal positions than all 38 presidents before him put together. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you may have seen RBG. If not, it's in the book. She says, I would never be on the Supreme Court without Carter. He opened judgeships to women, appointed me to the Court of Appeals. We supported affirmative action, minority set-aside, saved New York City and Chrysler for bankruptcy, all as a Deep South president. In foreign policy, his accomplishments were also very lasting. Camp David and the Egypt-Israel peace agreement, I have 4 chapters on that. It's an extremely interesting set of chapters, are, in my opinion, the greatest act of personal presidential diplomacy in American history, more even than Woodrow Wilson after World War I Paris peace agreement. 13 agonizing days and nights. He drafts 22 separate peace agreements, has to negotiate separately with Sadat, the president of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel, because when we put them together, they were like 2 scorpions in a bottle. We come close, but not there on the 13th day. Begin says, I'm out of here. I can't make any more compromises politically. Get me a White House car. I've got an El Al plane waiting at Andrews Air Force Base. Carter, realizing this would not only engulf his own presidency, could threaten Sadat's life and inflame the radicals in the Middle East, knowing and studying these 2 guys before they came into Camp David. This is not a one-day photo opportunity. Knew that Begin had a great love for his grandchildren. He gets a photo that was taken of the 3 of them in Camp David, gets 8 copies, personally autographs it to each of the grandchildren by name, walks it over to Begin's cabin, hands it to him, and as Begin reads each one of the grandchildren's names, sees his lips quiver and his eyes tear, he puts his bag down and said, Mr. President, I'll make one last try, and the rest is history. 40 years later, there's never been one violation of that. If I had time, I would give you the colorful story about the fact that Camp David was only an accord, not a treaty. Carter had to go back to the Middle East, almost failed then. It's another story that perhaps we can deal with in the question period. He put human rights at the center of foreign policy, applied it very controversially to the right-wing but pro-American, anti-communist military dictators in Latin America, and married that to the Panama Canal Treaty, which was our toughest fight to create a whole new era in U.S.-Latin American relations. Here again, something you wouldn't see today, one of the great heroes, in fact, indispensable to the passage of the Panama Canal Treaty, which 80% of the public was against when we started, was a senator of very small physical stature, but a giant of the Senate, Howard Baker, the Republican leader, knowing if he voted for this, it would probably foreclose forever his getting the Republican nomination for president, but he supported it. Imagine that happening today. One humorous story, an unlikely vote for 2/3 necessary. Senator Hayakawa from California, conservative Republican, who coined the phrase, it's our canal, we stole it fair and square. Hardly a likely vote. Mondale puts him on with Carter, and Carter says, Senator, what can I do to convince you to vote for the treaty? Nothing can convince me to vote for a treaty on the merits, but if you will let me see you once every 2 weeks in the Oval Office, just the 2 of us, to share my wisdom with you, then I'll consider it. And Carter says, only once every 2 weeks? I wouldn't want to limit you to that. Flattered, he voted for the treaty, and Carter never saw him again. We also applied human rights to the Soviet Union, to what I call their soft underbelly. We reached out to Andrei Sakharov and the democratic movement, to then Anatoly Sharansky, now Natan Sharansky, championed Soviet Jewish emigration and doubled the size. Sharansky says in his memoir, Carter saved my life, by saying I wasn't a U.S. spy in the midst of my trial. And we didn't only apply soft power and human rights to the Soviet Union, and one of the surprises of the book, validated by a new Pentagon study, Carter is the one that reversed the post-Vietnam decline in defense spending. All the major weapons systems, and I give Reagan full credit for them, all the ones he deployed, the mobile MX missile, the introduction of intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe, the stealth bomber, which you can see at the Hazy Air and Space Museum, the long-range cruise missile. We green-lighted all of those. And then after the Afghanistan invasion, Christmas 1979, even his most conservative critics say that this was his finest hour. We embargoed grain bill, highly unpopular, 4 weeks before the Iowa primary, where they happened to make a lot of it. We had draft registration for young people. We armed the Mujahideen. It's another story about how they morphed into the Taliban. We had the Olympic boycott, talking about a tough meeting, get these kids in who had spent 4 years training and telling them they couldn't go to Moscow. We created an alternative game called the Freedom Games in Philadelphia, but it certainly wasn't the same. And all of this, plus the so-called Carter Doctrine, was really critical in bogging down the Soviet Union and ultimately seeing to its collapse. China. Nixon and Kissinger deserve all the credit for reaching out to the People's Republic and the Shanghai Communique in 1972. The one China policy, but they didn't say which one, because they didn't want to take the Taiwan lobby on, which was very powerful in the Republican Party. We did. We cut relations with Taiwan, made it into a cultural and defense relationship, passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which was another bloody battle. Deng Xiaoping comes to the White House, the first state visitor. He's in the cabinet room. I'm there with him, and he says, Mr. President, and Jeff, you'll appreciate this because it's deja vu all over again. He said, I appreciate you restoring diplomatic relations, but what I really want is the lowest tariff levels that you give to your most favorite, so we can trade more with you. And he said, I know that there's a law, the Jackson-Vanik law, which precludes that, but that's aimed at the Soviet Union because they limit immigration. We do not limit immigration. And he took a little White House notepad and pencil, pushed it over to Carter at the cabinet table and said, write on this notepad the number of Chinese you'd like us to send you each year, 1 million, 10 million? And Carter, with a twinkle, said, I'll tell you what, we'll make a deal right now. I'll take 10 million Chinese a year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists. Neither had to fulfill that pledge. And Steve, we weren't including you in that, so don't worry. Iran is a whole different story. I'm very frank and brutal about the mistakes we made. I don't think it's fair to blame Carter for the revolution and the exile of the Shah any more than it would be fair to blame Eisenhower for the Cuban Revolution 90 miles from our shore in 1959, or Obama for losing Mubarak. There's certain things superpowers can't do, but having said that, I say in the book, I say it to you now, it was the greatest intelligence failure in American history. The greatest intelligence failure. Here is a CIA who put him back on the throne. 6 presidents support him with every weapons system. They didn't realize his domestic support rested on quicksand. They didn't know, imagine this, that for 5 years he was getting cancer treatments for an incurable form of cancer. They didn't realize the impact that the provocative cassettes that Khomeini, the leader of the revolution from exile in Paris, was having back in Tehran. Absolutely unacceptable. Impossible to make good decisions on that basis. Carter makes many mistakes after that. This is one instance where I wish he had listened to me. On the hostage crisis, what does he do? I recommended, Brzezinski, our national security advisor, recommended immediate military action, not bombing, but blockading the harbors to prevent their oil from coming out. Instead, Carter meets with the hostage families, promises them that his number one priority is getting their loved ones back healthy, and he does, but only after 444 humiliating days. in which our political support evaporated, makes another mistake by holding himself up in the White House, canceling foreign trips, not campaigning against Carter to show he's working full-time. That made him the hostage in the White House. It gave Khomeini more leverage. And Steve, you know from the press perspective, what it also did is it focused press attention. That's where the Nightline program with Ted Koppel started. The dean of reporting, Uncle Walter Cronkite, every single night, FDN, day 103, day 205, day 307 of the hostage crisis, hugely debilitating. And then the real straw that broke the camel's back, that was a metaphor for somehow Carter's failure, was the failed rescue effort. To this day, until hopefully people read my book, people say, well, it was because Carter didn't have enough helicopters. Wrong. The Joint Chiefs wanted 6, Carter added 2 more. That was the maximum that could fit under an aircraft carrier and avoid Soviet reconnaissance. It failed because there were 4 military services in an exceedingly complex measure that had never practiced together, never practiced together. There was no joint command. We created it afterward. And when the rotor blade of one of the helicopters hit the C-130 cargo plane with fuel to refuel the helicopters to go into Tehran, it engulfed 8 servicemen. It engulfed our presidency as well. So this book is not just about policy. It's got characters that could come out of a Shakespearean play, the tragic and the uplifting, the humorous and the villainous. I won't go into any of those except Jimmy Carter himself. Here's a person who comes from a gnat-infested hamlet of 500 people and makes it to the Oval Office with indefatigable campaigning, again, 100 days before in Iowa alone. And because he understood, and this is essential, I've been in many presidential campaigns, more losing than winning, it's the person running who understands the mood of the public at that moment. And even for Democratic voters, it was not for a great society repeated after 8 Republican years. It was someone who could come as an outsider to remove the stain of Watergate, to be honest and restore integrity. And Carter did that. Carter's was in some respects the first new Democrat, moderate to conservative on fiscal issues, liberal on race and gender issues, a free trader, God forbid, who believed in the importance of alliances. And yes, he could be criticized rightly for excessive attention to detail. He always wanted more backup memos. He used to send some of mine back with misspellings circled. But I've begun to think over the decades, it's better to have a president who knows a lot when he makes decisions than one who knows too little. I'll let you make that decision yourself. In many ways, his strength was his weakness. And that is, he was a ferocious campaigner, but he believed in parking politics at the Oval Office door and doing, quote unquote, the right thing. That enabled him to do Panama and the Middle East and energy, which were political losers. But he forgot that a president is not just commander-in-chief, he has to be politician-in-chief. He has to nurture his base and keep his party together, which he didn't. Trump, of course, has been a master at that. He had high moral principles and made it difficult to compromise. He said to me once, I feel that I should not horse trade. I've never done so in politics. So I'm not nominating Carter for a place on Mount Rushmore, but I think it deserves to be on the foothills with other presidents who have made great contributions to their country and the world. Now, let me conclude by talking about the economy. First, the unrecognized successes. The first one of which is we created 10 million jobs in 4 years. That's more than had been created by any of his predecessors. It's more than in 8 years with Reagan. And it almost equaled the number created in Clinton's first year. Second, we had the transformative deregulation that I mentioned, which paid off in terms of more competition and lower prices. Third, again, I mentioned cutting the Gordian knot on crude oil and on natural gas prices. It was Nixon who imposed crude oil controls. We ended them and creatively added a windfall profits tax to get the Democrats to support it. And this has unleashed, as I mentioned, tremendous production Fourth, we had great success after 5 years of impasse with Bob Strauss's help as well in concluding the Tokyo round, which had been stalled for so long. Fifth, experts, Putnam, Henning, and others, called the 1978 Bonn Summit a masterful model of how G7 summits should operate. With Carter's leadership, and everyone gives him the credit for this, we got Germany and Japan, Fred, to stimulate their economies, to take some of the burden off of us. We got the French to agree to concessions on trade, and that's where we threw in our lot with crude oil deregulation, something that was very unpopular with Democrats and with many of us on the staff as well. Now, let me talk about the failures on economics. The first was just structural. We did not have an economic coordinator in the White House. I urged Charlie Schultz to be that coordinator. He said it'll end my independence. I ended up de facto doing that, but it was not satisfactory. Second, our economic policy group, with which Fred worked and was chaired by Secretary Blumenthal, never functioned efficiently. It didn't have the confidence of the president, and he didn't interact sufficiently with it. Third and most significant, and with this I want to conclude because it's really important to understand, and that is our major economic mistake. And that was misjudging the force of the inflation pressures we inherited from Ford and Nixon. The decade of the 1970s saw a new economic phenomenon, not seen before and thankfully not seen afterward, a witch's brew of both low growth and high inflation. Economists had to give it the ugly name stagflation. It consumed all the presidents of that decade, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. It was occasioned by the guns and butter policy of LBJ, funding the Great Society and the Vietnam at the same time, aggravated by the first oil shock in 1973, the OPEC embargo, low productivity, high commodity prices, and a wage price spiral that began that was very hard to undo. During the 1970s, inflation never went below 5%, doubled the previous historic average. If you fought unemployment, it raised inflation. If you fought inflation, it raised unemployment. It was an exceedingly difficult thing to do. Now, please remember, we ran the 1976 campaign against what we called the Ford recession. And what we didn't appreciate is the recession had already ended when we came into office. Nevertheless, we stimulated the economy with tax cuts and spending programs in 77, again in 78. But please remember that economists, Republican and Democrat, including Paul McCracken, who I interviewed for the book, who was Nixon's economic advisor, all said that everyone thought in 77 that unemployment was the major problem and that there was so much unused capacity that you could stimulate the economy and still not increase inflation. That was really something that everyone believed to be the case. So we were sort of not completely out on left field. Carter was in many ways in the 4 years caught between his own conservative fiscal instincts. Jody Powell, his press secretary, said he was tight as a tick. He was a small businessman. He believed in balanced budgets. His prime goal was balanced budgets. He carried that through right up to 1980 in our last budget, trying to reach it. And he was aided on the sort of hawkish side by Mike Blumenthal and by his budget director at the time, Burt Lance. And on the other side, in the White House, were Mondale and myself, trying to keep the liberal wing assuaged with more social spending, moderately so, but still more so. And I say to you, I misjudged inflation. I made mistakes on this and didn't back him up as much as I should have. But the entire organized base of the Democratic Party didn't know the word inflation. They had no interest in fighting inflation. It was all jobs, jobs, and jobs, the so-called Humphrey Hawkins bill, 4% goal of unemployment. We insisted, Carter insisted, he would only sign it if there was also a 4% inflation goal. And everything we did on budget tightening was antithetical to the base of the Democratic Party, to labor, to big city mayors, to liberal Democrats who were in the governorship and in the Congress, to organized women's groups, and we paid a frightful price for that fiscal prudency. I mean, our budget deficits were half of Reagan's, but at a price of alienating the liberal wing and having Ted Kennedy run against us. Tackling inflation through fiscal and monetary restraint was seen by them as a Republican, not a Democratic policy. And so we were whipsawed constantly between the Democratic constituency groups on fiscal issues and Carter's own instincts on fighting inflation. He understood when he ran in '76 and throughout his presidency, we were in a conservative era. And he tried to pull the Democratic Party to the center, unsuccessfully. Remember, there were 8 years of Republican presidents before him and 12 years of Republican presidents after him. So he knew the era we were in, but the base of the party did not. We could never quite reconcile that, and it led Ted Kennedy to take the liberal wing of the party and oppose him and never reconcile. Just imagine a Democratic president who in his first speech to the Congress, his first State of the Union, says, government cannot solve our problems. Hardly what one would expect from a Democrat. In addition, we ran a very tight fiscal ship, as I've mentioned, and yet, with all of that, nothing seemed to work. So let me give you two watersheds. The first watershed occurred, and Fred was very much engaged in this, in November 1st, 1978. Inflation is increasing. The dollar is dropping like a rock. Lack of confidence. Ted, you were involved as well. And we do a dollar rescue program. $30 billion worth of money from the Treasury and the IMF, a 1% increase in the discount rate by the Fed, sell gold, create what were called Carter bonds, which were bonds denominated in German mark and Japanese yen. This was a fundamental turning point in which Carter, trying to balance stagflation by helping on unemployment and inflation, realized we couldn't have it both ways. We had to make fighting inflation the prime goal, and that really was absolutely seminal time for a turning point. Now, the second, just imagine this scenario. You have inflation, which had been about 6% when we come into office. It had risen to 8%, perhaps manageable under those circumstances, and then the Iran Revolution comes. Everybody associates, for obvious reasons, Iran with the hostage crisis. Iran had a second impact that was almost as devastating. 4 million barrels of oil are taken out of production, not a great percent actually in the total market, but the spot market went wild. People started buying wildly on the spot market. Oil prices spiked. They went up from $16 to $32 a barrel in less than a year, and occasioned inflation to go to double-digit range. So Carter calls us in. We're now facing an re-election period, and he says to us, I have tried everything. I've had to cut social programs to satisfy the markets and alienated the liberals in the party. I've had 2 anti-inflation hours. I've given 5 anti-inflation speeches. I've done voluntary wage and price guidelines with procurement sanctions for companies that violate them, that have government contracts. I've had a pay advisory board with John Dunlap, and nothing's worked. And I've got a fundamental choice to make. I'm going to give the toughest medicine that the economy can take. I'm going to appoint Paul Volcker to head the Fed, knowing in advance, as I described colorfully in the book, exactly what Volcker was going to do, because he told him so. He said, I'm going to tighten the money supply. It's going to cause interest rates and unemployment to jump. Don't appoint me if you're not going to back me up. And many of us were opposed to it. We said it's your reelection. And he said, I'd rather lose the election than make my legacy this enduring high inflation. And it worked. Inflation dropped like a rock in Reagan's first year. Not in time to help us in the 1980 reelection, and it's emblematic of so much of the Carter presidency, in which we laid the foundation of things that flowered only afterward. It was, therefore, in many ways, inflation was our Achilles heel, but was also, in many ways, also his greatest accomplishment. And remember again how other presidents in that decade had dealt with it, stagflation. What did Nixon do? He got Arthur Burns, the Fed chairman there, to goose the money supply up before his 72 reelection, put on wage and price controls to artificially control prices. Ford comes in with win buttons, whip inflation now, and budget cuts. So when you look at how enfeebled we all were, it made us look like, in fact, the economy was not in control. It's crucial for a reelection. And that's why, in effect, Carter ended up taking this stiff medicine, because nothing else had worked. It causes a broader question, and maybe we can get into that in your comments, Fred, and that is, was this the end of Keynesian economics? Did stagflation make it the end? Remember that Reagan adopted the Laffer curve in supply-side economics, which remains the base of Republican economic orthodoxy to this day. Carter is cutting, and Reagan is saying, we don't need to cut. We're going to stimulate, and we'll get all the revenue back. So one crucial question is, was this the end of Keynesian economics, the end of the Phillips curve? Did Carter's tenure mark that? Again, I'll leave that to the question period. But the point I'm trying to make is we faced an enormous challenge with stagflation. In the end, Carter did everything humanly possible, and nothing worked until Volcker. It did work. It's the reason we have low inflation today, and he deserves at least some credit for it. So again, I close by saying I'm not nominating for Mount Rushmore, but I do think he belongs in the foothills with other presidents who have made significant accomplishments to make this a better country and a safer world. Thanks.
Stu, that was terrific. And I don't want to deflect from you. You're the centerpiece today. Stu and Adam both asked me to make a few comments, so I'm going to do it, but very few. And then I want to open it up to Stu and with the group. I just want to underline 3 things Stu said and add 2 that he didn't say. The one is to underline his comment about Carter at the G7 summit process, particularly the Bonn summit in 1978. That, perhaps along with Jim Baker's Plaza Agreement in 1985, stand to this day as the most successful examples of successful coordination of international economic policy. It was a concerted, we called it the locomotive strategy, it was a concerted international agreement to restart the world economy and reduce international imbalances. Every country was fully implementing their commitments until the Iranian Revolution threw things off track. But it was a hugely successful venture. And as Stu said, it was the one case in history where a US president, or to my knowledge, any head of state, did an international agreement, brought it back home and used it to untie what Stu called the Gordian knot of a crucial domestic policy problem, in that case, oil price decontrol, which then paved the way for the response to the oil shocks of the 1970s. That was a truly historic development, and Stu rightly emphasizes it in the book. A second one was what Stu said at the end, the dollar crisis in '78, which was the closest the United States ever came to the feared hard landing of the economy and the dollar. I was sitting in the Treasury as it happened. The dollar was declining 4, 5, 6% per day. We had to call our German, Japanese, Swiss colleagues to get them to agree to swap currency with us, buy Carter bonds, agree to our drawing on the IMF, yes, the US drawing on the IMF, in order to defend the dollar. Stu says in the book, it worked. Volcker says in his new memoir, just published a couple of months ago, it didn't work until he took over. And Stu today basically said that, which has always led me to say that President Carter's single greatest decision was the appointment of Paul Volcker to head the Fed, because that did wring out inflation. The third thing, and Stu mentioned it briefly, but he says in the book, one of the great unrecognized legacies of the Carter administration was the successful conclusion of the Tokyo round in the GATT. And Jeff and Gary Huffbauer and I actually negotiated the subsidies code, which was the centerpiece of it, which is today hugely relevant because it's what Bob Lighthizer and company are trying to use to deal with China's subsidies. You got to add more subsidies to the code. You got to implement it more effectively. But that launched that whole process. But here was the most remarkable thing that Stu did not mention. Bob Strauss got the trade agreement through the Congress with only 2 opposing votes in the Senate and 4 in the House. Now, can you imagine any trade agreement going through the Congress with only a smattering of negative votes? In fact, I said to Bob when we were celebrating the success, I said, Bob, no trade agreement should go through the Congress with so few negative votes. You obviously gave away too much to your domestic pleaders. And he said, Fred, you're absolutely right. I wanted to get everyone for. And Stu says in the book, Strauss was mightily unhappy that there were those 2 and 4 who voted against him because he wanted a unanimous.
Strauss called me up and he said, Eizenstat, who are the 2 sons of bitches that
Right.
voted against that?
Exactly. And I said the opposite. The 2 things Stu did not mention, one, which again indicates Carter's political courage. And I think you mentioned this in the book, as the election was approaching, 1980 election, there was a huge upswelling of pressure for import controls on autos. That was when the influx of Japanese autos came into the US for the first time, Toyotas, et cetera. And so the UAW, a strong supporter of the President and the administration, but went over to Ted Kennedy, but strong Democrats, launched a massive plea for import quotas for autos. And there was a huge debate within the administration with pretty much the same lineup that Stu mentioned on other issues. Carter, to his everlasting credit, refused. That in light of inflation, in light of foreign policy, et cetera, I will not put on import quotas on autos. What did he do? He inaugurated a massive program of trade adjustment assistance for the auto workers. Exactly the right thing to do. As I remember, over $1 billion of assistance to the workers, by far the biggest implementation of TAA ever in the history of the program. Right in the face of the election pressure. And the unions, of course, calling TAA burial insurance. But Carter did exactly the right thing. Of course, then came Reagan, and what did he do? He reversed the policy. Reagan totally truncated the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program and had Lighthizer go out and negotiate a voluntary export restraint agreement with the Japanese to limit their sales of autos to the United States, the equivalent of import quotas. So Carter was the free trader with the courage, not the guy who sometimes gets credit for it historically. The other thing, and I'll take a little credit here for something we did at Treasury, when we came in, this was below the radar of the White House, although we involved Carter in it at a couple of key points. When we came in, one of the U.S. failings in the world economic system was that we had a huge backlog in terms of fulfilling our commitments to the international financial institutions, particularly the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the regional development banks, et cetera. The previous Nixon and Ford administrations basically trashed those institutions, opposed them, didn't support him at all. So we inherited a massive backlog, arrears to the institutions, and hostile congressional views on those institutions. So at the Treasury, we launched a year-long series of weekly breakfasts in the Secretary's dining room with 8 to 10 members of the Congress every week for a year to educate on what the IMF, the World Bank, et cetera, were, why they were in the US interest, why you should support them. In the next year, we changed over 150 votes, one support, and my last act as undersecretary a couple of years later was to sign the checks paying off all those arrears finally and fully. But it shows that you have to do retail politics, and that if you do it right, it can work. But you obviously have to be dedicated to it. Another unrecognized legacy of the Carter period. So I'm going to quit. I'm going to come up, ask you a couple questions, and then open it up to you all. Stu, let me start out by picking up on your last point about stagflation. And I'm going to look at Olivier and ask Olivier to come in. Because the message I take away from both the period and your book is that neither economists nor policymakers had any real answer to stagflation. And as you said, the remedy turned out to be going back to the old-time religion. Bring in Volcker, tighten the money supply, wring out the economy with a recession. And that did it, but nobody else had any good answers. A, is that right? And then Olivier, do we have any answers today if stagflation comes back?
Well, yes, it is right. And as I mentioned, we had this sort of celebrated meeting where Carter went through all the policies he had put in place, none of which were working. And he said, I'm going to try to implement the toughest medicine that the economy can take by appointing Volcker. And Volcker, again, was very clear. Volcker didn't sort of come in. He was not a closet monetarist. He was a pragmatist, but he understood. He was very critical of Bill Miller, who was our first Secretary of the Treasury, who was clearly too liberal. So much so, and this is remarkable, Volcker said, it's never happened in the history of the Fed, where our Secretary of the Treasury, Blumenthal, and Charlie Schultz, the head of our Council of Economics, privately actually went to Miller and said, you've got to start raising interest rates. But it was Volcker who took the dramatic increases, and Carter knew, because Volcker told him, what he was going to do, and he had run out of all ammunition. Now, could we have sort of bumped along with the inflation as it was? Perhaps. We made one other mistake that I didn't mention in a speech that's in the book, and this is the one area where Volcker is very critical of Carter. He's laudatory both in his memoir and this book, that Carter let him do his thing and didn't interfere. And that is, Fred Kahn came up with the idea that to augment the tough monetary policy by the Fed, we should do credit controls. And it was announced in such a way that literally people started sending us their cut credit cards. They thought that what we were asking the public to do was not, in effect, use their credit cards. It caused the biggest one-quarter drop in growth in modern American times. It also interfered with Volcker's own policy. He went along with it because he said Carter's been good on keeping his hands off of us, but it was another mistake.
Incidentally, I spent over an hour with Volcker a couple of weeks ago, another nonagenarian whose memoir has just come out, is very good. And to this day, he really praises Carter enormously for letting him do his thing. And in the face of an election, Volcker was hands off from the presidency. And when you compare it with Trump today complaining about interest rates that are where they are and going up at a very modest pace, and Carter facing election, a Democrat, allowed that to happen. Volcker has to this day, he does it in his memoir, did it when we talked, praises Carter enormously for his doing that. So Olivier, what's the answer to stagflation? Olivier heads up, he was, as you know, chief economist of the
I was
IMF,
too young.
And
I was too young.
and heads up this big effort we have. Heads up this big effort we have to figure out new approaches to macro policy.
So
Stagflation.
stagflation was a major blow to Keynesian economics. It was seen as the failure of Keynesian economics. And within academia, it had enormous impact. And it basically led to the success of Lucas, Sargent, a much more neoclassical view of things, much less interventionist. And it took at least 15 years for Keynesian economics to come back as a force within academia and within policy making. The financial crisis has made it even more so. So I think it has recovered. So it was not killed. It was maimed, but not killed. And it was clearly unfair because it was not a failure of Keynesian economics per se. It was a failure to understand the nature of a shock, which is that there are shocks which are going to lead to stagflation. And they had not happened before in that form. And when they happened, I think economists from all groups were a bit lost. It took a few years to understand what was going on. The answer is, what do we do when there's a shock like this? And the answer is, there'll be pain. And you have to decide how much of the pain is going to be high inflation for a while and how much is going to be high unemployment for a while. And that's the choice you have. You cannot avoid having one of the two, and you can choose your preferred menu. I think that's still where we are. Managing expectations, I think, would be the twist, which is if inflation is higher because of higher oil prices, you want to send the signal that this is not forever and that people are not going to change the way they think about the world. But it's a tough one. If it happened again, I think we would do better, but there would still be pain.
Thank you, Olivier. Let me open it up.
Can I just add one other thing? And that is, I mentioned that our budget deficits were so much lower than Reagan's. So the question was, why didn't inflation rise during the Reagan period? And I think it's because of the impact of monetary policy. People by then had confidence that Volcker would take care of inflationary expectations through monetary policy.
Immense recession.
Right. Right.
So you opened up again excess capacity in the economy and high unemployment. And I'll never forget, I worked with Mondale during the period when he was waiting to run against Reagan in '84 after the loss in '80 that Stu described. And I'll never forget, we had monthly meetings with Mondale and briefed him and talked about the outlook. I'll never forget Mondale saying all through '81 and early '82, he said, Reagan, that son of a bitch, he's taking his recession now, and when the election occurs, the economy is going to be roaring. And it was growing at 8 or 9% at the time of the election in '83, '84, and Mondale didn't have a
And
chance.
I've often asked, the sort of standard thing is, take your recessions early. But just look, now we had run in '76 against the Ford recession. I mean, we didn't realize it was over, but we could hardly have turned on the dime and say, forget all the tax cuts and jobs programs we promised. We're going to now raise interest rates and get inflation out of the system. It just would not have been possible politically.
Ted.
So, Ted Truman, Peterson Institute. As you said, I was part of this exercise, that period, and this is a very. I was saying to the young people of this table something about this era. And I think my forecast about what he talked about was pretty accurate, but unusually accurate. I think one footnote, interesting footnote, I think Fred and I both have seen Paul recently, is that when Volcker went to the FOMC and presented the program, which had been presented informally to the board already, and he may have done it then, what I'm about to say, but he certainly when he did the FOMC, and Volcker in his book says, I read the transcript and it doesn't sound at all like I felt at the time. But he never said, basically, that this had been endorsed by the president. So he actually, which I think was a way to protect the president. So I don't know, it was protect the president in some sense. Also it was a way of showing distance, but in some sense it also protected the president from the consequences. And you did get Paul to say on the record, which he rarely said, that basically he had no idea the interest rates were going to go to 20%. And he doesn't really like to say that, but I've heard him say it before. So I think but my question is more about process. So this is a very interesting book, right? And you described all the sources that you had, and I was again showing it to the young people about how thorough you were as a scholar, both in your pads and in your interviews. Both a bunch of them at the late end of the '80s, and then another bunch of them in this century. And was this an idea from the beginning, and then you took it up, and then you got involved in, I guess, in the Clinton administration, and then you got out of that in your Holocaust-related issues, and you finally said, as I remember saying to you at one point, I better get this done before the president dies, which you did, and I congratulate you.
Well, I was worried about getting it done before I died. So let me answer that question quickly and then go back to the basic issue of Volcker, because it's really important to understand this piece of history. I took 103 legal pads worth of notes, 5,000 pages, every conversation, every meeting, as I said. Not because I was going to write a book. I honestly didn't think about it, but because I saw it as a discipline. I'd put marginal notes, call Senator so-and-so, call so-and-so, follow up here. It was simply a discipline. Then, when we lost, I went to Brookings, across the street. We took, by the way, a lot of people, including Fred, from Brookings. And I was a guest scholar for 4 months. And it's at that point, Ted, that I decided I'm going to do something with this book, or with these notes. So this is pre-computer era. I went through every bloody one of those 103 legal pads, 5,000 plus pages, and I created an index alphabetically, A for abortion, A for agriculture, Z for Zambia. And every time I had a meeting on that issue, I put it into the index so that I could then go back to it. That's really how I started. The first interviews were in 1989. The last was in 2018, just before the book was published. So intermittently, I kept coming back to it. It was always interrupted first by 8 years with Clinton. When I went to Brussels, I said, oh, this is going to be easy. I'll have plenty of time to work. I didn't work 1 minute during those 8 years. When I came back, I had done the Holocaust negotiations. The publisher said, write a book on that. Then I wrote a book called Future of the Jews, and finally came. So all the time I had this in mind. And Fred and I were talking about this before we came down. I think in many respects, it's a better book for having that historical perspective. This is not a sort of quickie book by an aide trying to say the president was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and so was I. It's saying I made mistakes, he made mistakes, and I think coming out in this presidency actually gives it a perspective. Now let me go to Volcker. I interviewed him several times, look at the minutes of the meetings and so forth. When Volcker came in, it was not with a Friedman-esque monetary concept. He actually tried and barely won, he got like 4 to 3, to just raise interest, discount rate, 0.5%, 0.75%. And when he did it, the markets didn't react. And then Steve Axelrod, who was like his top staff guy, came up with a really brilliant concept, because Paul realized the difficulty of getting his own governors to keep raising interest rates. I mean, it's unpopular for presidents. It's also unpopular for Fed governors. And so he came up with this concept, I'm not going to raise interest rates. I'm just going to let the money supply take care of itself. And whatever happens to interest rates, happens to interest rates. Well, this was like a lifeline to the rest of the Board of Governors, because they didn't have to worry about raising interest rates. It was really quite an ingenious formula. It got the job done. without having to come back. Now, you're quite right, and he says so in the book, he never imagined interest rates would go as sky high as they did, up to 20%. And they wouldn't have had we not had the Iranian oil shock. I mean, we really might have gotten this thing under control, not down to 2%, but people would have seen a real decline by the time of the election. But unfortunately, the Iranian Revolution intruded, and so, you know, Paul was sort of working against the wind. But again, it's important to realize that his first instinct was not to say, this is a brand new policy. It was to try the conventional method, and then when that didn't work, to go to this more monetarist theory.
Bill?
Correct me if my recollection is wrong, but the 76 election, I believe, was exceedingly close, especially from electoral college
1%.
standpoint. And any thoughts on how you pulled that off or how close you got to losing, if it would be one question.
Yes, Bill.
And then the second question is, Reagan was always seen as a weak candidate, I think, within the campaign apparatus of the re-elect effort. At what point did you, even with inflation, even with Iran, there was always that sense of inevitability that the president was going to be reelected. Was there a moment when you realized, oh my gosh, we really do have a problem?
Yes, so in 70, those are both good questions. In 76, we came out of the Democratic convention with a 30-point lead over Ford. Now, yes, it was artificial. Anytime you're in a convention, you get a lift, but 30%. We lost all but 1/2 of 1% of that. I'm going to talk about why I think we did. And not only did we lose that, it was 3 a.m. Wednesday morning when Cliff Finch, the governor of Mississippi, called and said, you've barely won, and that put us over the top to 270. So here, look at this unusual coalition. We won every southern state except Virginia. That was our base. Every southern state. Hasn't been done by any Democrat since. We won in the end, I think, because of 2 or 3 reasons. First, because of the second debate in which Ford made this huge gaffe of saying the Soviet Union doesn't really control Eastern Europe, and that eroded his advantage on foreign policy. The second reason was the sort of lingering aspect of the pardon in Watergate. And the third, and I've interviewed Jim Baker, who was his campaign manager, as he was Reagan's, so it'll draw me out to your second one, and became, of course, Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of State. And he said, Stu, you guys won for 3 reasons. The economy, the economy, and the economy. There was the perception it was the Ford recession. In fact, unemployment was 7%. Inflation hadn't gone down, and that was a huge advantage. Now with Reagan, we thought Reagan was going to be an easy candidate to defeat. Here's a former movie star. He's against Medicare. He's against Social Security. He's against Medicaid. You know, Wild West, trigger finger on the nuclear bomb, and so forth. We had Jesse Unruh come from California, who was the chairman then of the Democratic Party, and he said, you guys don't underestimate this guy. He's been 2-term governor of California. He's a terrific politician. We still did. And in the end, people say, well, okay, you lost overwhelmingly. Why did we lose? We won 6 states in the District of Columbia. We lost by 10 million votes in the popular vote. I mean, that's as close to a landslide as any incumbent has had since Herbert Hoover. So we lost for a couple of reasons. First, because of inflation. Second, because of Iran. The notion was, if you can't get your hostages out in a third-rate country, what kind of president are you? But here's the crucial fact. We made a fundamental political decision and mistake of debating Reagan in the only debate, 8 days before the election. He was a masterful debater. It took away the fear factor, the aw shucks kind of guy, and he had an advantage. which Jim Baker in the interview mentioned. And that was, I said, Jim, there was a hearing on this in Congress about you stealing the debate book I prepared for Carter. Is it true? He said, yes, it's true. He said, our chairman, Casey, came in 2 weeks before the debate, plopped this book down and said, I think you might like to look at this. It's our debate book. All the attack lines, when Reagan said, there you go again, he knew everything we were going to say. And Baker said to me, you know, Stu, I gave it a moment's thought. I know I was dealing in stolen goods, but only a moment's thought. And then he said, my greatest fear, it's really funny, he said, my greatest fear was there was a congressional investigation afterward. And he said, I was going to tell the truth, and I did tell the truth. I said, we stole your debate book. But Bill Casey, who had headed the OSS during the war, predecessor CIA, denied that he had ever given it to me, and I was afraid, having headed the OSS, he could pass a lie detector test, and I would be the one that would be. So we lost that debate, and we were ahead going into the debate. Okay, 8 days. The weekend before, on Sunday, the halo effect of the debate had worn off. You can look at the NBC and CBS polls, not just our internal Cadell poll. We were again even or slightly ahead. And then what happens? So we're now talking about the Sunday before the Tuesday election. We're in Chicago. We feel like we've got a second breath because we had made Reagan into a demon. There wasn't a lot of positive stuff to run on. And we're in Chicago at the Hilton Airport Hotel. I get a call at 3 o'clock in the morning. Air Force One is ready. You got to be on it. Carter's going back to Washington. I said, what do you mean he's going back to Washington? He'd gotten a new offer from the Iranians. And I begged him not to go back. I said, look at the offer and make a decision now. And in fact, it was a step forward, but not enough. Instead, he goes back. It revived the whole hostage issue. And bang, we just went absolutely through the roof, through the floor in terms of losing support. So at what point did we know? I think we saw as the campaign was evolving how skillful he was. We certainly saw it at the debate 8 days before, but we always said, does this sound familiar? The public can't do this.
It also, Stu, your stories are fascinating about how the great, powerful United States, even 40 years ago, was really vulnerable to external events. The dollar crisis forced the shift in economic policy, and the Iranians turned the tide of the election.
Right.
I mean, this, for those who say the U.S. is the great, dominant, all-powerful hegemon, evidence to the contrary.
So, I mean, I think about this very often. I mean, again, Brzezinski and I recommended blockading the harbors, keeping the oil from going out. So Carter's answer was, oh, that'll get the hostages back, all right, in a coffin. And I felt that was absolutely not the case. Carter did say privately through the Swiss to Khomeini, if you have any show trials, if one hair on the head of any of these hostages is harmed, I'll go in militarily. And it didn't happen. Khomeini's support was, at that point, still unstable. I don't believe he would have risked the chance of doing so. And so by not taking that firm action, I think we lost an enormous opportunity.
We're past our witching hour. Steve Weissman gets the last question.
Don't leave without buying a book.
Right. Books are for sale.
I was there during all these events. I was 12 years old at the time. Stu, look at the current landscape. Carter is not the only Democratic president. In fact, if you think about it, every Democratic president since Kennedy, including Johnson, has been disabled by fights with the left, and you could include Obama in that because of his actions during the rescue of 2009 of financial institutions. What do you see today emerging, this battle happening again in the Democratic field of centrists being vexed, in effect, by the left wing of the Democratic Party? How do you see that playing out?
Well, it's really a critical question as we go into 2020, and I will say to you this. I mentioned, Bill, why we won against Ford. I omitted one critical issue. Anytime a sitting president is opposed in a significant way by someone within his own party for renomination, it weakens him greatly. In this case, it was a guy named Ronald Reagan who almost won the Republican nomination against Ford in '76. So the Kennedy nomination was crucially difficult in terms of splitting the party. He never reconciled. He gives a speech at the convention. He made it his convention instead of Carter's. The dream will never die. You know, no clasping of the hands at the end. So now let's take it to 2020. People read the 2018 election the way they want to read it. If you really look at the data, the reason why the House flipped is because of so many suburban districts where moderates, women and men who had military records and so forth, won. I think it's a clear message that we need a centrist. The problem is when you run in these bloody primaries in Iowa and so forth, you get the left base that's out. And my only hope is that there'll be so many people competing for that left-wing vote that it will allow a centrist to come in and capture it who can actually win. But it's a fundamental problem. You can see where the real activists are. They're on the left, and that will be the case in some of the early primaries. So whether it's Sanders and Warren and Booker and others competing for that vote, it leaves an opening for a Biden or a Klobuchar or Hickenlooper or whatever, somebody running or Bloomberg running in the middle. My experience is I think there were 16 candidates against Trump 2 years ago. I think there'll be that many on the Democratic side. But by the time you get through with Iowa and New Hampshire, and then you go into Massachusetts and so forth, I think that number will be down to 4, 5. And then you have the real battle. And I simply hope one of the people or more who survive will actually have a chance of beating Trump. But if we go too far to the left, Trump will have a field day. I mean, there are two things that will be decisive: the state of the economy in 2020 and the candidate we have.
Stu, the country is in your debt. All of us are in your debt. We thank you once again for everything you've done and for spending time with us today.
Well, this is a special place, and you're a special person in my life.
Well,
So many of you are as well.
Thank you, and thank you for the book. And everybody go buy it.